And now please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, this is June, which means, among other things, we are in the midst, or perhaps at the very end of, Pride Month. Woohoo! It's a good time to break out the rainbows and celebrate. But the truth is, I wish I could be in a more celebratory mood. Something about all the anti-LGBT legislation and rhetoric these days makes me profoundly sad. I feel like the movement takes 2 steps forward and then 1 or more steps back. All the hate out there has also prompted me to think about the nature of pride. In spite of the ubiquity of rainbows and talk of pride, I've often found that many people don't know the history of pride and why it matters. So I'd like to attempt to get us all on the same page. We are an open and affirming congregation, so we really should have a good sense of what pride is all about. And I will say at the outset that some of the things that I'll talk about might make you feel uncomfortable, but I ask you to bear with me. I feel strongly that preaching is an opportunity for truth-telling, so I will do my best to tell the truth about pride. And I'm happy to talk about this with any of you further. Perhaps it'll lead to some fruitful conversations. It goes without saying that gay people have always been a part of society. You can read the dialogues of Plato or any number of other things from ancient Greece and Rome and find plenty of references to homosexuality. There's evidence of gay people throughout history and across cultures. The very fact that there were laws against gay people shows that they existed. You don't make laws about something that doesn't happen. In the American context, we have evidence of gay life going back to the 17th century, including a rather amusing series of stories from 17th century Connecticut, Puritan Connecticut. Yale historian George Chauncey wrote an excellent book on the gay history of New York in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and showed the vibrancy of gay life there at the time. But starting in the 1930s, things began to shift. In response to the Great Depression, Christian groups led by the Roman Catholics pushed to limit gay visibility. Whenever the economy turns sour, there will always be those who seek to root out vice in an attempt to purify the morals of society. The longest-lasting effect of these efforts was the enforcement of the so-called Hollywood Code that prevented any same-sex attraction from being shown in the movies. But like with the civil rights movement and with second-wave feminism, the key turning point for the gay rights movement was World War II. In World War II, you had millions of men mobilized in the armed forces, and there, in the military, gays found one another. And when the war ended, these soldiers were discharged, usually either to New York City or San Francisco. Many of them then decided to stay in these cities. And yet, while you had these burgeoning gay communities, the post-World War II era saw a dramatic rise in laws intended to target the gay community. Somehow, homosexuality became tied with communism. Homosexuals became a national security threat. Senator Joe McCarthy brought up the connection between homosexuals and communism constantly. Ironically, his right-hand man, Roy Cohn, was himself a closeted gay man. At the same time, Alfred Kinsey published his landmark study on sexuality that showed that there were far more gay people out there than most people imagined. By the 1950s, the situation for gays was bleak. There were systematic attempts to purge homosexuals from government service. Vice squads in various cities regularly attempted to entrap gay men so they could prosecute them. Any sexual encounter could turn into a prison sentence. 49 states outlawed gay sex. A further 29 states enacted gay psychopath laws that carried stiff penalties for those found out to be gay. In Pennsylvania and California, sex offenders could be committed to a mental institution for life. And in 7 states, they could be castrated. Cross-dressing was also made illegal in most states. One of the first organists I worked with was Harry Huff. Harry grew up in eastern Tennessee in the 1960s, and remembered guys in his high school going to Knoxville to roll the queers. They went to cruising spots to pick up a gay man and then beat him up and robbed him. They knew, of course, there would be no penalty for this. This was seen as fun for the high school students that Harry went to school with. Now, not everyone, of course, was content to live in the closet, even back then. Harry talked about how his much older first cousin was as gay as Christmas and let his flame burn bright, as the saying goes. He was out and proud at high school back in those days. A few years later, his body was found stabbed in a dumpster. The police never pursued it. And in spite of this climate of persecution, the first groups arose to actually advocate for gay rights. The Daughters of Bilitis and the Mattakean Society formed networks in several cities and published their own newsletters. They argued that gays were just like straight people and should be left alone. What gays and lesbians did in the privacy of their own homes should not be a source of persecution. But their efforts yielded little results. It turns out the homophobes, they didn't care. The turning point in the movement happened on the night of June 28th, 1969. The site was a gay bar on Christopher Street in Greenwich Village in New York City. The bar was a dump. Owned by the mafia, they served overpriced, watered-down drinks in dirty glasses. But it was one of the only places where gays could go out and dance. That June night, it was hot, and the temperature inside was stifling. For whatever reason, the police chose that night to raid the Stonewall Inn, as it was called. The New York State Liquor Authority banned serving drinks in lewd and immoral spaces, which meant gay bars. It was grounds to shut down gay bars, and periodically the police would round up the patrons, arrest them, and often publish their names in the papers, at least the names of those who didn't pay off the police. The NYPD would regularly take payoffs to leave the gay bars alone. Now, this particular night, the police were determined to shut down the Stonewall Inn. The raid happened around 1:30 in the morning. The bar was packed, and the police detained those who worked at the bar and those who were cross-dressing, while taking the names of the other patrons. It took some time for the paddy wagon to show up, and in that time, word spread that the Stonewall Inn was being raided. The bar was on a park, and there was plenty of space for a crowd to gather. As people were dragged out of the bar, several patrons resisted arrest. The crowd became angrier and angrier. People began throwing pennies and bricks at the police. After the paddy wagon pulled away, the crowd got out of hand and actually forced the police inside the bar. The standoff lasted until more cops could show up, but the crowd refused to disperse. The police eventually ran away, and the crowd discovered the power of resistance. For the next several nights, people gathered in front of the Stonewall Inn in protest. The police were powerless to do anything. The riot was reported in the New York papers, and several weeks later, the city changed its laws and pledged to stop harassing the gay community. It marked the biggest victory to date for the gay rights movement. New gay rights organizations sprung up in response, organizations that had greater militancy and participation than ever before. And the following year, a march was organized in Greenwich Village and the Castro in San Francisco to mark the anniversary of the Stonewall Inn riots. And that was the very first Pride parades. Those were. The previous strategy of keeping a low profile and say that we're just like you didn't work. The Pride marches were about claiming gay identity and refusing to be ashamed about it. We're queer and we're here, and you know what? You're just going to have to get used to it. Now, being gay has always been about sex, and there is so much shame around sex in this country. So the gay pride marches did not shy away from the sexual element of being gay. You have to get over that, it turns out, if you want to learn to embrace gay people. So yes, gay pride parades included women and men showing overt affection for one another. People would dress in a sexualized manner intentionally. Gays were not going to feel shame over their same-sex attraction. Now, over the course of the 1970s, there was an increasing embrace of the gay liberation movement. And at the same time, there was the inevitable backlash. Anita Bryant led a movement to ban gay people from teaching in schools in California, based on the overused trope that gays were pedophiles. And one of the key ways that Bryant's movement was defeated was for people to come out of the closet and show their pride. Once people saw that they knew gay people, that gay people were not the villains that society and the movies so often made them out to be, that the pedophile trope was nothing more than a convenient lie, Bryant's rhetoric lost much of its force. Then came, of course, the darkest period in gay history, the coming of the AIDS pandemic. In 1981, gay men began dying of a rare cancer. The medical community could not figure it out. The CDC began issuing warnings and calling for government support and research. That support did not materialize. In fact, when a reporter first brought up AIDS at a White House press conference, Reagan's press secretary openly mocked the reporter for bringing it up. He laughed about it. Americans were dying, and the Reagan administration saw it as a joke. In 1984, when Reagan was running for re-election, he joked that gay stood for "Got AIDS Yet?" People were dying. Ronald Reagan did not make his first public statement about AIDS until 1987, 6 years after people first started dying. By then, 25,000 Americans had already died before the president made his first statement. Think of what happened when Ebola came to the United States. President Obama made maybe a half dozen public statements when one person got sick. In the 1980s, gay men were dying at an alarming rate, and the government did not care. Several years ago, my friend Tim McCarthy, who spoke here at my installation, gave a talk on the history of the gay rights movement. After talking about AIDS, he paused and then added, quote, "On July 5th, 2004, the day Ronald Reagan went to hell, over 20 million people were affected with the AIDS virus." Tim's point was clear. If the government had treated AIDS as it would any other disease, millions of people, gay and straight, all over the globe, their lives quite possibly could have been saved. In the end, 350,000 gay men in the United States died from AIDS. Yet it was only after Magic Johnson got AIDS that the American views began to shift. An entire generation of gay men was wiped out. There's a well-known photo of the San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus in 1993. Of the 122 men in the photo, 115 died of AIDS. In that environment, with all the hatred and shame and death swirling around, I'm sure you can see why pride mattered so much. It was one time when the community and its allies could gather, celebrate life, and reject the constant stream of shame. When I first had sex, I was 23 years old and living in England. I remember waking up in the morning and feeling such shame that I sprinted to the train station to get away. It took years for me to get over my shame around being gay, such that I could actually have a healthy relationship with someone else. In a context like that, pride matters. It literally saves lives. So much has changed in the last 20 years. In 2003, the Supreme Court overturned the laws in the country that outlawed gay sex. That same year, the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled that gays could marry in this state. Now, the fight over marriage rights was one that many gays were at best ambivalent about. Many argued that once gay marriage became a thing, there would be this expectation that gays would be like straights and get married, and then, of course, have a nice house in the suburbs with a white picket fence and 2.2 dogs. But nevertheless, the fight for marriage was one that was worth fighting. But now we have a situation where places like New York City openly embrace the LGBTQ movement, while all across the country, states are passing laws against trans people and trying to prevent any talk about the existence of LGBT people in schools. In major cities, of course, pride celebrations have become far less edgy. Corporations dominate most pride parades in major cities. But even corporations are facing backlash for their support of their LGBT employees and customers. So what are we to do with pride? First off, I'd like to thank you. Many of you I know have long been advocates for LGBT rights. Some of you supported people dying of AIDS back in the 80s and 90s. Others of you have been on a journey of LGBT acceptance. And I know that that journey is not easy. And I thank you for your willingness to be open-minded. The next thing I would like to say is to resist the temptation to separate the world into the good gays and the bad gays. Particularly with the advent of gay marriage and greater acceptance, it's easy to say, oh, I like those gays. I like the gays who dress well, are married, might have kids, who fit into the expectations of heteronormative society. Those are the good gays. The bad gays are those who are gender nonconforming, have lots of sex, eschew marriage, use terms like queer, have radical politics, or are too much in your face. Now, the whole purpose of Pride is for people to live who they are without shame. Do your best to understand those LGBT people who might make you feel uncomfortable. Do not bring predetermined categories that grow out of heteronormativity. It was not long ago when every gay was one of the bad gays. LGBT people can help you break down unhelpful categories and actually see people for who they are or who they're trying to be. Another thing I would say is that as Christians, take the opportunity that LGBT people give you to deepen your theology. Being gay has forced me to really wrestle with the Bible. I have become a far better and more educated reader of the Bible as a result. LGBT people can also help us think more deeply about sexual ethics in a constructive way. What do sexual ethics look like in the 21st century? Even though very few mainline churches still see sex outside of marriage as a sin, not many people have thought through what sexual ethics we should have and why. But LGBT people have thought through this. We've thought about it deeply, and you can learn from those reflections. What is the nature of community? What is the nature of sacred space? What do we do with the fact that Jesus hung out with those whom society marginalized? Thinking through these things will make you a better Christian, and LGBT people can offer important insights. And I'd also ask you to think more deeply about your fears. Fear has always been at the root of anti-LGBT persecution. Oh no, if we allow gay marriage, we will undermine the nature of marriage. There was this fear that marriage would somehow be cheapened if gays could get married. That fear, of course, was unfounded. There is a fear now when you see so many young people coming out as gay or trans or gender nonconforming. It can feel as though things are changing too quickly, that our greater acceptance has led to a proliferation of young LGBT people. The fact is that when Alfred Kinsey did his famous study on sexuality back in the 1940s, he found that roughly 4% of the male population were gay, as in they had no attraction to the opposite sex. He found that roughly 11%, or further 7% on top of that, were gay, as in given the choice, they'd opt to be with a same-sex partner for their life. Yet he also found that a further 25% of the men he surveyed had sexual experiences with other men. This was back in the 1940s. And then when he did a similar study with women, Kinsey found the percentages of people with same-sex attraction slightly higher. Now these numbers, even though they've been debated back and forth for the past 80 years, line up shockingly well with what we see with young people. This is nothing new. Greater acceptance does not lead to more LGBT people, but it does lead to less shame, and it increases the chance that someone will find happiness. And that's not something to fear. The final thing I would like to say is to highlight that there's still more work to be done, even in a place like Wellesley. A few months ago, Mark Roble, the new minister at the Wellesley UU Church, wanted the town to host a Pride event here in Wellesley. I have to say, personally, I was a bit ambivalent about this, but I was certainly supportive. And after talking to a member of the Wellesley Select Board, Mark was urged to gather the names of local clergy to show their support. And then when he brought this before the Select Board, he was told that Wellesley would not sponsor a Pride event, but that he, Mark, was welcome to organize one and apply to use the space in front of the town hall. He asked the Select Board to pass a resolution declaring June to be Pride Month in Wellesley. Now, I thought this was pretty innocuous resolution, but apparently I was wrong. The resolution proved to be, quote unquote, too contentious. One Select Board member objected to the fact that clergy were sponsoring the resolution since it blurred the lines between church and state. Now, I wonder what this person would say if clergy were sponsoring a resolution, say, about the prevention of gun violence. In the end, the resolution was contentious enough that Mark decided to withdraw it altogether. Mark was deeply hurt and surprised that such a simple resolution met with such hostility in Wellesley. I was less surprised. Wellesley is not a queer-friendly space, and I doubt it ever will be. For me, if I want to celebrate Pride, I will go seek out my people in Boston or P-Town. I have no need or desire to celebrate Pride here. But it does beg the question of how this must seem to the LGBT-identifying students at Wellesley High School. Apparently, their existence is, quote, too contentious to be celebrated in their own hometown. That's not a great message to send. 54 years after Stonewall, Pride is in a weird space. Despite opposition around the country, or perhaps because of it, there is a need for people to stand up and not feel ashamed for how God has made us. Whenever I think of Pride, I will always come back to our reading today from Psalm 139. When I was coming out of the closet, I had this passage posted prominently on my Facebook page. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well. I hope that regardless of whether you identify as LGBT or not, you can celebrate the unique ways that God has made you. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. So this weekend, celebrate that. Celebrate the gay people you know in your life. Love others without preconceived notions, but because they're children of God. That, I firmly believe, is what God would want us to do. It is, after all, what Jesus did. If he were here today, I have no doubt that he would march alongside LGBT folks and their allies in any Pride celebration we have. We are all made in the image and likeness of God. Be proud of how God has made you.